Well, good evening and welcome. We're going to get started this evening, and we're delighted that you've taken time out of your day to join us tonight. We know everyone is busy, so we appreciate you being here and making the effort to join our conversation. Tonight's topic, environmental policy in Washington State. What has worked, what hasn't, and how to navigate the future for the best outcomes. This should be a spirited conversation. I look forward to diving into this topic. But first, we have a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's program. If you would like to access playbacks of the discussion, you can email wpcevents@washingtonpolicy.org. You can check with me after if you missed that as well, and we'll happily follow up with you. In just a moment, our esteemed panelists will introduce themselves and provide their opening comments, which will kick off this discussion. If you have a question for one of our panelists, we ask that you hold your question until the end. We will have a Q&A session, and we will have Jillian going around with a microphone. And that way everyone can hear your question, and please feel free to ask anything. And now it's time. With great pleasure, I'd like to turn things over to our panelists for their introductions. Todd, I will start with you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Todd Myers. I'm the Vice President for Research of the Washington Policy Center. We are hosting this. We're very appreciative that we have our other panelists here, but on behalf of the Policy Center, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I encourage your questions. That's the most interesting part of this always, is when you get to ask questions, because things we say will spark questions and thoughts in your mind, and we want to address those. But I've worked in environmental policy in Washington State for 25 years. I used to work at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I've served on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council. And so stewardship of the environment is really important to me. It's something I've dedicated my career to. And for those of you here in the room, I imagine it is the same. In Washington State, we pride ourselves on taking care of the environment and being good stewards of the environment. But the fact is that in this state, in so many areas in the environment, despite that pride, we are not meeting our goals. We are not meeting our CO2 reduction goals. As we experience almost every summer, we are not caring for our forests. They are unhealthy, and every year we face smoke and wildfire, and that's not just bad for people, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for wildlife, and we are not recovering salmon in the way that we should, and at the rate we should. And so the question is, why is it that there is such a disparity between what we care about and what we prioritize and the results that we actually see? And that's what I want us to talk about tonight, or one of the things that I want us to talk about tonight. But I'm going to leave you with a success story, something we have had success, and why I think we were successful. So a few years ago in Washington State, we had the Asian giant hornet, which was called the murder hornet, come to Washington State. And there was concern about the spread of the Asian giant hornet, this invasive species. For people, they're scary. I've seen them. And then also for beekeepers. I'm a beekeeper. They go into hives and they can destroy honeybee hives very rapidly. But instead of sort of the typical way that we tend to address problems, which is through government studies or agencies doing projects and things like that, what the Department of Agriculture, the Washington State Department of Agriculture did is they went out to beekeepers, they went out to communities, and they set up traps for the giant hornet. And then when they caught one, a researcher at the University of Washington created a little tag, and they glued it to the hornet and followed it back. And then they were able to find the nest and eradicate the nest. And the thing I loved about this is that it was ground up. It wasn't top down. It was engaging the people on the ground, the people in the communities, the people who cared, who had a stake in the game, and using the newest technology. And last year they announced that the Asian giant hornet has in fact been eradicated. We haven't seen them in years. That is a wonderful success story, and it is a model for how we should do things in the future. And I want to talk more about that. I think that's something that we don't do enough, and it's a way we can get back on track on the environment.
Thanks, Todd. And thanks everyone for being here tonight. My name's Amanda Parrish. I'm the Executive Director of the Lands Council. The Lands Council is a local environmental nonprofit. We're celebrating our 40th year anniversary this year, so we're the longest standing environmental nonprofit here in Eastern Washington. I've been a part of this organization for 16 years. So I started as an AmeriCorps member, as our volunteer coordinator, and for the last 4 years have served as our executive director. Before working at the Lands Council, I worked for the Kalispel Tribe, which is what brought me up here for work. And at the Lands Council, 40 years ago when we started in the 1980s, it was the timber wars. And it seemed like everywhere you looked around here, these great national forests of our region were being bled dry with these massive clear cuts. And so a group of physicians at Sacred Heart started a club in their break room called the Inland Empire Public Lands Council, where they were watchdogs for what was happening in the forest. Eventually they shortened that name to the Lands Council. And we sort of changed our tactics. After the first few decades of our work, we really would be the group that were chaining ourselves to the forest roads and trying to stop the logging from happening. And around the turn of the century, we started what is the country's first forest collaborative, Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, which is still active and presides over the Colville National Forest. The Colville National Forest is the most productive national forest in the country, so there's more timber harvested just north of here out of the Colville National Forest than any other national forest. And we, the Lands Council, work with Vaughan Brothers Timber, with the Forest Service, with the tribes, with backcountry hunters and anglers, to make sure that the logging that is happening there is done in a way that's actually regenerative for the forest. So it's maintaining the economic viability while also stopping everything from getting slowed down in legal battles. So I'm really proud of the work that we do in our collaborative endeavors. And above all else, I think that my message tonight would be that collaboration beyond any policy is the most important thing that we can do. And collaborating with unexpected partners is a huge strength. And I'll just say one other success story while I have the mic, which is that today, just this morning, we started the first day of a pilot program. The Lands Council has an urban forestry program, and we've been planting trees in Spokane County, thousands of them. But the thing is, planting a tree is one thing. Watering a tree is the real hard work afterward. And so that's the work that we have to do. And we pay crews to do tree watering, and we've planted really densely this high-use trail in Spokane Valley. And those trees are now being watered by our partners at Career Path Services, another local nonprofit, and their Dignified Workday crews. And so it's actually people in our community that are homeless, facing housing insecurity, who are being paid, fed lunch, given transportation there to do dignified work that's visible in their community, that's watering a tree where they live, where the people walking by thank them. And so I think that's the kind of collaboration and partnership that can be hugely successful. I'm so proud of this program that just started today. So I just wanted to share that success with you all. Yeah.
All right, I'm excited to hear about that program. That's awesome. So my name is Mike Lithgow. I'm the Director of Policy and Outreach for the Kalispel Tribe's Natural Resources Department. So the Kalispel Tribe's reservation is about an hour north of here on the Pondre River. It's about 4,700 acres and in the Cusick-Usk area. I've worked there for about almost 10 years now, and prior to that, I was a land use planner for Pondre County, and the role I play with the tribe is, I feel, an important one. The tribe's Natural Resource Department does so many things, so diverse and vast. Starting in 1992, the tribe created the program with 3 staff, 2 biologists and 1 technician, and now today we have about 50 full-time staff, which is one of the largest natural resources departments in the region. We do a ton of work over the 2.3 million acres of Aboriginal lands that is the Kalispels, which go from Knox in Montana all the way through the Pend Oreille River drainage, Clark Fork, Pend Oreille, into Washington, all the way to Canada. And so that place is really important to us. We do forestry work, we do fisheries work, wildlife work, archaeology, water quality. So the kind of the gamut, the suite of essential natural resource. We study things. We do a lot of restoration. We feel like that's our sweet spot, is to really get out there and make habitat better, make it more productive. Because the reservation is so small, the Kalispel depend on our public lands to go out and hunt and fish and gather. So if there's good elk numbers on the landscape, good deer, good bear, and those are benefiting non-tribal members, they're gonna benefit tribal members. So from a self-sufficiency perspective, the Kalispel Tribe has really they really pride themselves to be collaboratively sufficient. There's no way that we could get the conservation outcomes we need by doing that alone. We can't do work on other people's property without their permission. So we're put in a position where collaboration is just, it's embedded in our systems and in our structures. And so I think that tonight I'm really excited to have a really good open conversation with these folks about Washington and Eastern Washington in particular. A lot of the rules that we live by come out of Western Washington, and they don't always fit very well. And so, this last legislative session, when Todd contacted us to write a letter of support for some legislation he was working on, which would have done some permit streamlining for salmon recovery work, we were like, heck yeah, some of the hardest work we do is to get the permits for some of these projects, and it takes a really long time. And so it wasn't successful this session. It did require some extra money, and that wasn't in the books. But I think we're going to bring that back in the future, and hopefully we can get a win on that, because if we can spend less money jumping through the permitting hoops and more money putting good projects on the ground, we're going to have more fish, more wildlife for all of us to eat. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you, panelists. And some of these questions have a little bit of background, so just bear with. Let's jump right in. Catastrophic wildfire is a growing problem in Washington and across the West, and we're headed into another high fire danger summer. In 2021, the legislature passed a bill that permanently authorized spending $125 million to fight fires each 2-year budget cycle. However, this year, according to an article by the Associated Press, a budget proposal from Washington House Democrats in March came in $85 million short of that $125 million allocation, while the Senate's was $40 million short of that target. But combined with cuts to federal spending, what should be done to protect our forests and our natural resources? And I'd like you to think about this question in the sense of what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how do we move forward?
Well, there's two things, I think. One is with regard to the budget. The interesting thing about that is that they budget in advance, but then they go back and they pay for what happened. So if they budget 80 million, but it costs 125, the legislature gets to come back and find the additional money for what was spent, because nobody wants to get to August and say, sorry, you can't fight forest fires anymore, you're out of money. Fortunately, we don't do that, but the budget numbers can be a little misleading because it's nature who makes the decision, not the policymakers in Olympia. But it's a little bit backwards, right? Because what you're doing is you're dealing with the problem after it has already occurred, rather than trying to prevent it. And what we need to be doing more of is managing our forests and getting them back to a healthy state so that you have fewer catastrophic fires to deal with. For a long time, what we thought is that we wanted to reduce the amount of fire in the forests, because obviously we didn't want communities burning and things like that, and what that left us with is unhealthy forests. Too many trees, too small space. If you look at pictures from 100, 150 years ago, you will see these forests in eastern Washington where there's a lot of space between the trees. Now we look at forests and we think if it's very dense and lots of trees, that's natural. That is not natural. And so what we need to do is to get back to what those forests were traditionally, which was fire-adapted forests. And that requires management, it requires thinning, it requires harvesting, it requires restoration. In many cases, that costs money. So the work that you're doing with like the Vaughan brothers have focused on taking trees that normally would be seen as low value and turning them into value. That's fantastic. But we need more of that. We don't have enough mills. We don't have enough infrastructure to do all the work that we're doing. But there was a great law that was passed in Congress in the last year called Good Neighbor Authority, which allowed the state could already work with the federal government actually to do work on federal lands. And now tribes have the authority to go do that. So where they neighbor federal lands and there's an unhealthy forest and they say, your mismanagement is threatening our lands, tribes and the state and now counties also can go work with them to do the work that needs to get done. So that way we're not always playing catch up and saying, okay, how much did it cost to fight the fires? We can get ahead of the curve so that we have fewer fires to fight.
Yeah, I agree with you, Todd. I think that tools like the Good Neighbor Authority, the Tribal Forest Protection Act, they are ways that others can help participate. In 2015, the tribe was faced with a fire right at the doorstep of the reservation, and it was the first project-level fire that the elders had seen in their lifetime. The forests up in Pend Oreille County, they don't burn a lot. We get a lot of moisture and a lot of snow. That is changing a little bit. But that fire in 2015 called the Tower Fire, it started up on South Baldy and spread pretty significantly. I mean, there's been bigger fires in Central Washington, a lot bigger. But for us, it was a big deal. And the tribal council called our natural resource leadership into the chambers, and they were like, are we doing enough to help our neighbors manage this landscape? And the answer was no, that we weren't. We weren't doing what we think we could do. So at that point, we wrote a letter petitioning the Forest Service to engage in a Tribal Forest Protection Act project, which was a 90,000 acre planning area. 40,000 of those acres were federal lands. It was a real patchwork landscape of private, public, state, Stimson, just a random mix, which makes it really hard to manage. You've got lots of road issues and just challenges when you have that kind of patchwork ownership. But we were like, well, we know it's going to be hard. That's why nobody's doing it. That's why this forest is in such tough condition. So we said, we're going to do it. And with our DNR partners and our Forest Service partners, we went through a really comprehensive NEPA process and got that approved. And now they are logging those projects. We worked with NUFIC and those folks to engage in the early process to make sure that we were threading the needle. And I feel like we were. That project was litigated, though, from a nonprofit out of Montana, and that was recently heard in federal court in Spokane. We feel really strongly that with the coalition of people that supported that project, that we're going to win in court, but there's no guarantees on that. But that's an example of how we can work together to reduce fire risk, get the fuels out of the forest. And the tribe's sweet spot is not the logging part. We don't do that. We're not the log buyers or sellers, but we can do the conservation work. We can come in and remove the culverts that need to be replaced. We can come in and do the habitat work, that kind of stuff that is often doesn't happen because it is expensive and it's challenging. And so when we can come in and we can bring other resources, we can grow the pot and we can make that stuff happen, we can get all those objectives met, hopefully. And that's our goal.
Yeah, I'd add that there's, when we talk about how to reduce the problem itself, not just react to the problem, there's thinning the forest, and then there's also retaining water in the forest. And as we know, there's changes in snowpack and the timing of that, and more precipitation as rain. And so one of our unexpected partners in retaining water on the landscape are beavers. Beavers build dams, beavers make wetlands. There was a great study done looking at aerial imagery in a national park in Canada that didn't have beavers in it, and then beavers were reintroduced, and prior to beavers being there was a drought year, and once beavers were there for 50 years, there was another really extreme drought year. And when beavers were present, there was something like 200% more water that they could see in aerial images. So beavers are nature's engineers that really keep water on the landscape, because they have to keep water on the landscape. They're clumsy on land and they're graceful in water, and that's how they access their food sources. They don't really need our help. They're not an endangered species. They're rodents. They can reproduce on their own, but they need our help with habitat. So that conservation work, they need their food forage, which is like aspen and cottonwood and other riparian trees. We at the Lands Council know that beaver dams themselves help create the conditions that make those trees present. And so we can also make beaver dam analogs, which is like a human version of a beaver dam. We work with Gonzaga civil engineering students to look at the watershed and design where we're putting these in. So another unexpected partnership that we're leveraging more funds from to get more work done. And this is something that, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but there's already beavers in the landscape, and there's policy work that can be done around streamlining permits, so that when beavers are plugging up a culvert, we can more easily permit our ability to put in a culvert protection device so that we don't have to lethally remove the beavers, and the beavers can remain where they are and naturally find new habitat. We've also been involved in policy that's changed beavers from fur bearer status to like species of restoration value. So there's policies that can be done around this where we can partner with nature on these solutions.
Thank you. And on the topic of water, according to the Department of Ecology for the state of Washington, the 2024 water year, which is October through September, was warmer than normal statewide and drier than normal for most of the state, ranking as the fourth warmest on record in the Pacific Northwest across the 129-year record. And while drought conditions improved in western Washington and Oregon, in western Oregon, they worsened in the inland Pacific Northwest. There have been talks of amending the permanent emergency drought relief rulemaking. A local example, possibly, of attempted water conservation can be found in the lawn watering schedule set by the city of Spokane. What types of conversations should we be having around our water usage?
Well, I think it's a good step that the city of Spokane has made this water conservation ordinance that is linked to in-stream water flows in the Spokane River. So only when the Spokane River flows have gone low to a certain level where habitat, where fish habitat is in danger, we ask our citizens to water on an every other day schedule. So far, the needle is slowly moving in water conservation, is what I've seen in the presentations. I think part of the reason that we use so much water here in Spokane is because it is so readily available beneath us, and it is very inexpensive. I have compared water bills to my family in San Diego, and it is 100 times. It's 100 times a factor more that they're paying for every unit of water. So water is really affordable here. And I think that's a great part of living in the inland Northwest, but I think that leads to an unfair idea about how much water we have, because it does affect the water levels in the river. We are in danger of someday in the summertime having next to no flow in the Spokane River, which would really impact the economy of the region and tourism. And so I'm glad that we've made this effort collectively to ask our citizens, hey, we're voluntarily adopting this. This is something that we all need to do together. And the city of Spokane has also done a lot to study water use in their own parks and make sure that the soils are being watered not to over 100% saturation of what the lawn actually needs. And so the golf courses and parks that are managed by the city are actually watered really efficiently, which is something else that the city could be really proud of.
Okay. So I have a project to talk about that is a water conservation project we're doing up in Ponderay County. It's a little different. It's not a city. It's a very rural issue. But working with agriculture, I think, is important. We've got, we sit on the Voluntary Stewardship Program working group in Ponderay County, and that group is charged with running a grant program to help pay for, to help keep agriculture viable, but at the same time protecting critical areas like wetlands, floodplains, things like that. So in partnership with our Salmon Recovery Funding Board, we have worked with the Conservation District on a 100-year-old irrigation system that is originally served 13 farms in the Skookum Creek drainage, which is a tributary to the Ponderay River. And we, the conversation started with those farmers. They were, the maintenance on that old ditch, open ditch system was a lot, and they were losing a ton of water. And at this point, the water wasn't making it to like the last half of the farmers. So it would go into the ground, it would evaporate, super inefficient. So we are actually in the process of funding the first phase of that. We got the farmers to the table. We got the citizens advisory group to, a bunch of folks, technical folks, the regulators. We're like, how can we help these farmers, but at the same time keep that cold water? This is a spring-fed creek. It's, it has native trout in it. How can we keep that water in the creek longer, but at the same time get the water that the farmers need to those pivots and those irrigation systems? And so we're going to put in a new head gate with a fish screen. So because there was fish in the ditch, it was in bad shape. So we've got, we're going to start that project next year, the implementation of that project next year. But I think big ag they tend to have more resources, and they have big irrigation systems, and a lot of them are in a lot better shape. But it's those medium and small agricultural producers that can really use the help. And I think that's where it takes partnerships because they weren't. I mean, just this first phase is going to be like $400,000 to implement, and if they left to their own, they would not be able to pay to have that done. So I think it kind of like it starts at the ground up. You got to work with those landowners, build their trust, because they don't really want a bunch of strings, and they want to do the right thing, but they also have pride in what they're doing. So they're people. You got to meet them where they are and come up with solutions that meet their needs and meet your needs. So.
When you start working on water policy and an environmental policy, water is a lot. Makes a big difference. One of the things you will hear is the saying that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And that is certainly true. There are so many, our water policy is based on rights that go back a very long time. It's very complicated, and it's difficult to sort out. And one of the reasons that costs in San Diego are higher than here is because we have more rain, but also because politics and rules, and they play a very big role. It is not simply a market where you pay based on the supply. There's lots of other factors that make a difference. And I think that kind of distorts it. There are some people who use more water than they should because the price is low, and there are other people who use less because the price is very high. And so we don't necessarily allocate water where it's best used because the prices are distorted. The other thing is that when we do a drought declaration, one of the things that happens is that some regulations get reduced, that farmers are able to use water more flexibly. I asked, we have an agriculture director, Pam Lewison, who is a farmer, and I said, why don't we just do that all the time, right? Why don't we just give more flexibility? Because the farmers are the ones who need it. They're going to make the judgments, because if they don't use it right, their crops suffer. So they're going to use it when it is best, and they're going to be able to better manage that than government. But let me say, we've talked a lot about farmers and land, things like that. But a lot of water, obviously, is used in urban areas. And I think that people don't appreciate how much water is wasted and how we can do a better job in urban areas. And for a long time, the rules have been set by government and management and things like that because that's the only way that we could do it. We just didn't have many options. That's not true anymore. We now have technology that, again, allows us to empower homeowners and others to be better stewards of that water. And so there are now technologies, and I wrote a book about this and that mentioned this called Time to Think Small. And what happens is you can now buy a technology that you hook to your water meter that tracks how much water you're using. And it will do two really useful things to you. Three really useful things. Thing one is it will just tell you how much water you're using instantaneously so that you can track it. And once you start watching something, you realize, oh, I'm using a lot of water or I'm not using it. The second thing is it'll tell you if you have a leak. Lots of people have toilets that leak and other things like that. About 10% of water in a household is lost to leaks. But most of us don't realize that until we get our bill at the end of the month and we go, holy cow, why is my bill so high? And it's because you've had a leak this whole time. This technology connects with your phone, you'll be able to see immediately. But the coolest thing actually is that for, I think about 3 to 5% of homes, they have some kind of catastrophic water leak that causes $10,000 in damage. And this technology will immediately tell you, hey, something is going on. Water is really rushing through, and you can instantly turn off the water to your house from your phone and prevent the damage. And so, in fact, insurance companies have subsidized people buying these and putting them in their house because it reduces insurance claims. That sort of empowerment to take control of how we use water didn't exist 5 and 10 years ago. But now it does, and it's something that we don't think about when we talk about water policy and water conservation, but we need to think about more because the technology now exists to do that.
So a follow-up there, Todd. You're talking about voluntary water conservation. Those are tough conversations to have. How do you frame that with someone who doesn't live in San Diego, who doesn't pay a lot for their water?
Well, first and foremost, it's voluntary, but it's financial. Right? If I save water, if I can find a way to reduce the 10% of water that I waste because my toilet is running and things like that, I save money. You don't have to care about the planet at all. You can think that beaver pelts are better than live beavers, right? And not care about water or anything else. You could be the most anti-environment person on the planet, and if I say, if you save water, you're going to save money, they will do it, right? Aligning those financial and personal incentives with the environment really makes it powerful. But of course, the person I've just described doesn't exist. Right? Everybody wants to be a good steward. Everybody wants to feel like they're doing it, but oftentimes they feel disempowered or they feel like it's too hard. But if you say, not only can you help the beavers, you can also help yourself, now people are going to do that. And I think that we underappreciate the value of lots of little small actions and what they can add up to. We tend to think, well, I mean, I'm just doing this one thing. I'm planting a tree. Is that really doing anything? And the answer is yes, because in aggregate, that's really how you make a difference.
Todd, thank you. Mike, this is probably a question.
The way I love beavers.
Yeah. World Caribou Day is coming up, June 6th. Caribou are considered endangered in Washington, and efforts are underway to bring herds back to the northeast corner of the state. Mike, can you talk a little bit about the progress being made, and can you also tell us why it's important?
So caribou, when I first started working for the Kalispel Tribe, we had caribou in northeast Washington, a very small remnant herd that had was in a precipitous decline. Had gone from about 40 some animals to, in 2019, when they were extracted from right across the border in Canada and taken further north, there was 3 of them left. And it was pretty sad to see them go because, we don't know if they're ever going to come back. The caribou are really important to the Kalispel. They used to hunt them up in Upper Priest Lake. They are on maps. They're in the stories of the elders. Caribou taste really good. We would love to have caribou back on this landscape. It's a sad loss. And a lot of people were asleep at the wheel while that population was declining. And I think we learned a tough lesson that when things like that happen, we need to take action, and we need to take action fast. I think that, I just got an email from our charitable giving program director this afternoon that we had approved $10,000 to donate to the Arrow Lakes Caribou Society again this year. 2 years ago, we donated $50,000. We're really trying to support our Canadian partners to help their recovery efforts up there. They've got a really good program. They're taking pregnant female caribou, about 10 to 12 of them a year, and they capture them in about February, March, and they put them in a maternal pen. So it's an exclosure, basically, to keep predators out while the caribou are calving. And so you get these, we went from getting like 10% survival of the calves, and depending on the year, maybe 0, up to like 80% survival. And so we can make a lot of strides when we get that many new calves on the landscape every year. So our hope is that we, with a lot of human intervention and a lot of money, we can get those herds back up and healthy, and then hopefully our Canadian friends will help. We've been helping them, and they'll donate some caribou back south of the border at some point. It's a really near and dear to the Kalispel, and I'm hopeful that that at some point I see a caribou live in Washington or Idaho in my lifetime, but we'll see.
Mike, thank you. How do we balance environmental protection with economic vitality, especially in rural and agricultural communities? How do we balance environmental protection with economic vitality, especially in rural and agricultural communities?
Well, I think it varies from place to place, and I think that you have to, I think the people on the ground and the communities can make that, are best able to make that decision and determine that balance for themselves. So I'll give a couple of examples. There was a research done about conservation projects around the world that were done, and to see which were effective and which weren't. And what they found is that conservation projects that were run from a national capital were successful about 20% of the time. But conservation projects that were run on the ground in that community or by tribes in that community, this is not just the United States but around the world, achieved their goals 50% of the time. So the local decision making really made a difference. And so where you find that balance and how you achieve those goals is often best done at the local level rather than being imposed from outside. Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, this is what she did her research on, was how you do environmental stewardship and where you find that balance. And what she found is that when you do it locally, you're able to come up with more collaborative solutions that are more likely to be durable than those that are imposed from the outside. There's an organization called PERC in Montana that's a free market environmental think tank, and I have an article in their magazine in December about the Quinault Tribe. And the Quinault Tribe managed their forests, or didn't manage their forest. The Bureau of Indian Affairs managed it for decades, I think like a century. And they were massively over-harvesting, and they weren't replanting. And the problem, among the problems, I should say, was that they didn't replant. They said, there'll be natural regrowth. But the trees that they were harvesting were cedar, and cedar trees are naturally resistant, have a chemical that resists decomposition. And so the trees never decomposed, and there was no place for regrowth. Well, the tribal members who were there were seeing this, but of course the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I mean, the local people were, but in Washington, D.C., they didn't know this. And so they were pushing for more revenue. And the revenue was going to the tribal members, which was good, but the mismanagement, they were not paying the cost of mismanagement, but the tribal members were. And so the tribe, about 2 decades ago, took over the forestry on their reservation. And what they will tell you, and what they told me, and I quoted them in my article, is that they're much more careful about finding that balance, about what they harvest, what they leave, buffers along streams, those sorts of things. But when I said, so like, do you manage for revenue? And they said, yes. We harvest very much like a commercial timber company. They're finding that balance. They're finding the way to get the revenue as well as protecting the environment. And they are doing it in a way, again, that distant agency staff could never do because they're not on the ground. So it is a hard question, and we constantly fight about where is the line, but the people who are best able to set that line are the ones who are on the ground because they pay the costs both of underutilization of natural resources and overexploitation.
I think working with people where they're at, again, is sort of the theme. But again, in the Colville National Forest, I would much rather see a family-owned timber company that has been there for generations, who has a vested interest in making sure that their kids can hunt in that forest the way that they were taught to, the way that their father did. That's something that helps us know that the forest is being managed with the best interest, instead of major industrial scale timber harvesting, which is just another form of industrial agriculture. We need to be protecting family farms. We need to be protecting family timber farms, just like we're protecting family food farms. And here, I've been working for a long time on watershed restoration and tributaries of the Spokane River, down south of here in the Hangman Creek watershed. There's a lot of family-run farms. There's also some big farms, but it's one of the few places in Spokane County where we still have family-run farms. And there's some really important water that runs through that private land. There's a tributary of the Spokane River, and we want that water resource to be clean and protected. But for a long time, I was asking these farmers, hey, you need to stop farming this land, this fertile land. You need to put a riparian buffer there. And who's going to willingly, voluntarily take a pay cut to their bottom line because it's the right thing to do? That was a really hard ask, and I wasn't making any progress there. And it wasn't until we started working with the Spokane Conservation District and designed a program that's supported by Washington State, where there's commodity buffers, is what's it called. So when someone takes that land out of production, they are paid the insurance value of that crop, and they're not missing any money to their bottom line. And so I think you really have to, when we talk about protecting family farms, protecting family agriculture, it's always been done somehow with some state or federal assistance. It's which part of it are we assisting, and who are we looking out for? But I think it's important that we look out for those small businesses.
So I think even though it's not been horribly successful at the state level, I think salmon recovery in Washington is a bottom-up approach in the projects that are identified, that are ranked, and that are eventually funded. In our watershed, it's been very successful in restoring a lot of native salmonid habitat. We don't have salmon in the Pond River, but we have endangered bull trout, and we have West Slope cutthroat. And West Slope cutthroat were petitioned to be listed on the endangered species list in the late 90s. And I can't remember exactly the year, but that petition sparked a lot of excitement. All the people in the community did not want them listed. And so we said, well, what can we do to get them to keep them off the list? How can we make their habitat better? How can we get their numbers up. And so we are part of the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, which, it's we have a endangered listed salmonid with the bull trout. And so I think projects that are designed, that are chosen by local people that live there are much more durable. It's way better than like if somebody in Olympia was to select a project and say, that's your number one project. Well, the county commissioners and the tribal representatives and the conservation districts, they know the projects that are the most important. And so they make the list. And the list is then sent to the state for funding, which is really helpful. But I think that the conservation economy that comes with those projects is pretty important. I don't think it solves all of our economic problems. Pend Oreille County is a pretty rural. There's not a lot of money in Pend Oreille County compared to a lot of the counties in the state, but it's a piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of folks using big, heavy equipment doing these projects. There's a lot of surveyors, engineers, folks that are planting trees. That all is money coming from out of our area, going into our economy and helping diversify that very small portion of Washington State's economy. But I think that bottom-up approach is crucial.
Let me add one more thing. I want to emphasize one of the things that you said, which is that if you're asking either a forest landowner or a farmer or somebody to set aside part of their land for a buffer to provide a societal benefit of salmon or clean water or something like that, and you're asking them to bear the costs for what is a societal benefit, we shouldn't be surprised that they're going to bristle at that. We get the benefits. All of us get the benefits. If we care about that, we should be willing to pay for it. We shouldn't just say, you know what I want? I want more salmon, and you should do something about it. We should recognize that if we're going to ask them to take part of their land, we need to work with them. But if we decide, okay, that's what we're going to do, we need to compensate for them so that we all share those costs because we all share the benefits. The one thing I will say about farming or forestry or anything big or compared to big or small, one of my favorite sayings is there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So, as much as I love small farmers and family foresters, big agriculture companies and big harvesting is more efficient in a lot of ways. You can do more with less. And if you, in some ways, you can say, okay, small farmers are great because they're connected to the community or they have more conservation benefits or things like that, but they also use more water, more fertilizer, more fuel per acre. Whereas bigger operations will use less water, less fuel, less fertilizer per acre, right? So there is a trade-off for the environment. You may get some environmental benefits in terms of habitat or other things like that, but you may lose other environmental benefits in terms of less efficient resource use. So we always have to keep that in mind. So I just want to make sure that I put that out there.
We'd like to open up this discussion to members of the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We will have Jillian running around with a microphone to hear your voice. I would ask that everyone in the audience, please keep your beaver questions for Todd to a minimum.
Are we on? My name is Enrique, and I just had a quick question. I don't know if I'm making this up, but it seems like people's allergies have been far more intense recently. Like allergy season lasts a lot longer. There's a lot more pollen. And I've heard that it's because urban planters don't really plant many female trees. Is that anything that you guys know about? Is that true? Does that lead to more intense allergies? How can we ask our city to plant more female trees to address that?
I'll take that one. There's a trend in urban forestry a couple decades ago that we're really feeling the effects of, and that was, trees are selected in the urban environment for a lot of reasons, and one of them is aesthetics. And so people love flowering trees. And so the Bradford pear is this white flowering tree that's used in a lot of commercial areas, and that is definitely this male tree epidemic that plagues us with pollen every year in the springtime. The trend in urban forestry has changed a lot now, and I think there's a greater understanding of wanting diversity in the urban forest, and looking at both that sort of like male and female tree species is one of them. So I think that's there's more diversification in the urban forest, but we're still sort of feeling the effects of that trend from a few decades ago.
Thank you. Hi. Yes. Thank you so much again for coming and your time and your great comments. I'm curious, in water conservation, nobody mentioned the idea of creating more reservoirs or larger reservoirs to catch more of the runoff, because we usually have a fair amount of snow in the winter, or rain.
Talk about beaver dams. I think reservoirs can be a tricky thing to manage too. That Avista spends a lot of money managing the 9 Mile Dam and the sediment that comes downstream. The Hangman Creek watershed that I mentioned brings a lot of sediment into the Spokane River, and so if the reservoir is downstream of that, there becomes a big issue with sedimentation of the river, and that changes fish habitat and all kinds of things. But I think that water storage on the land in a lot of different formats is needed, and so both in this micro beaver dam habitat and the combined sewer overflow tanks that the city's invested in to help keep some of the stormwater back and release it at an appropriate time. All of those things need to be done in tandem.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think part of that can be managed through like the timing of the releases is really important. They can micromanage these systems way more than they used to be able to. So like, for example, we have a dam on a small reservoir. It was a natural lake, but they put in this dam in 1910 and on Sullivan Lake, and now it's expanded its ability to, and so that dam's still there. But about 10 years ago, they were able to sell a bunch of that water to the lower Columbia, to the agricultural community down there. And all they had to really do is manage when they released it, because the farmers needed it at a certain time, and it was in this lake that was really only being used for recreation. And so it's the PUD that manages the dam was like, well, why don't we made some money to help support the local community, but also support the farmers. So building new reservoirs is challenging, it's expensive, it's hard to do, but just managing the reservoirs we have, better and more efficiently, I think is a really good way to kind of help out too.
One of the issues is just simply timing. So people think of quantity. People think that with climate change that you're going to get less water, more drought. Actually, the opposite is true. You get more water because warm air can hold more moisture. And so what research shows is that you will actually have more stream flow and in many cases more rain as temperatures go up. So you have more water. What do you do with it? And we do need more capacity to hold that water because we have not seen a trend of reduced snowpack in the Cascades. We have seen less snow at lower elevations. Overall, though, we've actually seen more snowpack over the last 20 years in the Cascades, which reflects this pattern of more precipitation. But you have to hold it. So how do you permit and build massive reservoirs and the costs? And again, you get into the streamlining, you get into the permitting, all of those sorts of challenges. So it's not that the water won't be there, it's that the water will be there, but we need a way to capture it because in the future, less of it may be held as snowpack, but there will be more water to be held.
Hi. With regard to wildfire mitigation, there was some discussion about selective cutting, harvesting, and other prevention techniques. Is there an estimate out there how short are we of funding for either paying directly for it or getting mills started to do something with the wood that comes out of the forest in order to accomplish those fire reduction, fuel reduction goals?
I don't know that, I have not seen an estimate of the cost because the cost is so astronomical. I think that they only do short-term estimates. It's like, okay, what's the next step cost? We have, I think, in Washington State, something like 1 million acres that need to be treated. That's in Washington State. So it is a huge amount. A lot of that is federal, and as much as the federal government is spending, there's nowhere close to the resources to do the work that needs to be done. So that's the challenge is that there's way more work than there are resources to do. Now, part of the solution to that is taking smaller logs or logs that have low value and turning them into something. So there was a company that was doing what's called cross-laminated timber in Spokane, which was trying to take some of that low value and turn it into structural. And unfortunately, that didn't work, but other companies are trying to do that. But those sorts of things are good. The other thing is that I have a friend who is working in Arizona on this very problem. And what they found, they were trying to get more mills. And people were interested in investing in mills to do this work in Arizona, but they said, look, we need a guaranteed 20-year flow of logs. If you can guarantee us for the next 20 years that we will have supply, we'll build. How do you do that when a significant percentage of your supply comes from federal forests and federal management is unpredictable or subject to lawsuits or those sorts of things? And so how do you get the capacity? How do you get the infrastructure simply to do the work? And so even if the federal government could say, hey, here, we're going to back a dump truck full of money up and we're going to do this, you still don't have the infrastructure to do the work and building that infrastructure. So it is a tough problem, and we're not close to where we need to be. There are some good tools that are being put in place, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I agree. There is a lot of work, and it's very expensive. A couple of things I want to touch on from what Todd said were, there is a company in Colville, one of the Vaughan brothers, Russ Vaughan, opened up a CLT facility up there in Colville. So hopefully, we can have more of those creative uses. Hopefully they are economically viable and we can use, more wood doing creative things like that. Another tool that's relatively inexpensive where we can treat a lot of acreage, and it can be challenging with community members, but it's prescribed fire. It's a lot less expensive to burn in the spring and the fall than to go in and do it mechanically. So you can do a lot, you can cover a lot of ground, and you can burn a lot of those fuels. And one thing that is like, if we don't burn those fuels when it's safe to burn them, they're probably going to burn when we don't want them to burn. And so I'd much rather have smoke in the air in November than I would in August. And so I think we're going to have to get used to smoke in the air at certain times of year, and we're just going to have to know that that's an ounce of prevention, and it's going to be something that there is associated risk, but I think it's a low cost way to cover a lot of ground.
I don't want to filibuster here, but I do need to tell a story about controlled burns, which is that I think that the prescribed burns, which is great. When I was at the Department of Natural Resources, we did a prescribed burn in the Methow Valley, and the smoke went up, and then there was an inversion, and the smoke went down, and so the community got upset. Understandably, I get that. But the Department of Ecology put out a press release accusing us of treating the people in the community like, and this is the quote, guinea pigs in an experiment. Now, okay, I get it. You don't want the smoke in the community, but the attitude toward prescribed burns and the recognition of the need for prescribed burns has changed. I don't think the Department of Ecology would do that today. I hope they wouldn't. But that's one, as you mentioned, attitudes, I think, need to change. You need to be careful. But at the time, I remember just being furious because we were trying to reduce the risk of threat to the community. So anyway.
This is a question for probably Todd, since we're talking about eco-policy. So the Climate Act that raises about $2 billion a year, can you explain what it's done and where the money went and where it should go?
So you asked a small question, like, what should we do about climate policy in general? I'll have it settled in 2 minutes. So the Climate Commitment Act, which we voted on last fall, the voters decided to keep it. It imposes what's called a cap and trade system, which puts a price on CO2 emissions. In Washington State, that's primarily gasoline, diesel, and natural gas for home heating. There's some other things in there, but that's really where you see it. Right now, it costs about 40 cents a gallon for gas, about, I think, 50 cents a gallon for diesel, and then it varies on natural gas. So it generates revenue, as you said. And so what do we do with that? So the argument is that what we do with that money is that we do things that mitigate the impact of climate change. So one of the projects last year was $45 million to help people buy electric vehicles, because shifting from a gas-powered to an electric vehicle reduces CO2 emissions, obviously. The problem is, from my standpoint, and look, I think we need to do things about climate change. We need to reduce the risk. We can argue about whether the risk is catastrophic or whether the risk is manageable, but no matter what range you're in there, we need to do something. There is risk, and what you should do is you should get the most bang for the buck. And the criticism that I have had of it is that we don't choose policies based on where you get the most bang for the buck, where you get, if it's a crisis, you would want to make sure that every dollar we spend yields significant CO2 reductions. So we did a study, for instance, on the electric vehicle subsidy, and the analogy I used is that it would be like, in terms of CO2 reduction, how much you were paying to reduce CO2, it would be like paying $1,200 for a latte, okay? You pay a huge amount for tiny environmental benefits. The state put out a report from the Department of Ecology last year ranking projects in terms of what it costs to reduce CO2 emissions. And one of the projects cost $40,000 a metric ton. Every year I buy about 20 metric tons of CO2 to offset my emissions. I pay $10 a metric ton. The state for some projects is paying $40,000. So I think, without getting into all the details, right, I think fundamentally we should all be able to agree that every dollar we spend to improve the environment, whether it's CO2 or everything else, should yield the maximum benefit, and we're not getting that with the state Climate Commitment Act.
Hi, my name is Rick Perleyberg. I'm an agriculture and natural resources teacher at Reardon High School. And question for Mike, but for the rest of the board too. You told the story about the caribou, and I guess the short question is: do we have a caribou problem, or do we have a predator problem in Northeast Washington? And I guess I'm curious for the panel. What type of decisions moving forward, especially for Northeast, Southeast Washington, do you guys have regarding predator policy?
Yeah, I thought this might come up, but yeah, I work with your brother a lot with the WCU extension, and yeah, great guys. But the predators are challenging. They are challenging to manage, but like all other wildlife on the landscape, we manage them. We have objectives, population objectives for deer, for elk. They raise the number of tags, they lower the number of tags. It's a process that comes out of our Fish and Wildlife Commission and recommendations from our WDFW biologists. So the tribe is strongly in support of active management of all wildlife, because we have a highly manipulated system. We have roads, we have communities, we have all these things, and there's only so much social tolerance for predators on the landscape. And when you start bumping up against that, you know it really quick. And predators are important. They've been here. Wolves were native here. My grandfather used to hunt up above Bede Lake, and he has a story of wolves howling in the 60s. They would come out of Canada in small numbers. It wasn't a lot of them like there are now, but it is there. this was their native home. And I think we can manage them in a way to keep their populations as such so that they are not negatively impacting our herds of elk and deer and moose, but also allowing them to be on the landscape as well. So I think it's a balance, and it's never going to be a perfect balance, but I think it's the objective is to try to keep those numbers in a sustainable fashion. Because if they get too high and they start impacting people's pets and the herds are down, you're going to see people killing them on their own, and you're just going to see it's going to we should be able to hunt them. People would pay money to buy tags to hunt these wolves, and they're doing it successfully in Idaho. They haven't been relisted. Wolves are incredibly fecund. They breed like crazy. They're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be here unless we start poisoning them on the landscape. They're not going anywhere, and we need to actively manage them through trapping and hunting. So anyway.
Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Christopher Savage. How can we promote and support nuclear energy usage here in Washington State, and since it is carbon neutral?
You said nuclear energy? Well, it's hard. I think that the tide is turning definitely on that. You've seen countries in Europe that had banned nuclear opening up for nuclear again. There are new technologies like modular nuclear. And I can never remember whether it's Amazon or Microsoft, right? So we have increasing demand from data centers and other things like that. And either Amazon or Microsoft has contracted to reopen 3 Mile Island. Now, Microsoft. So when we were getting to the point that people are willing to reopen 3 Mile Island, you can tell that there has been an attitudinal shift about nuclear. People recognize that it is safe, that you have to manage it well, but the improvement in technology, and especially with modular nuclear, it has the promise of doing several really cool things. One, using spent fuel, because spent fuel still is radioactive, and there are several of the modular nuclear plants that's what they use as the fuel. That you go and you take this stuff that we see as a problem right now, and they turn it into energy. Second, they're modular, so they're small, so that you can build them more cheaply, because you can build several of them. So the concern about giant costs and delays and other things like that if you can approve it and get it so that they can produce it, then the costs come way down. The other thing that is not appreciated about modular nuclear is the way energy is used is that it's low at night, goes up in the morning when we wake up, goes down in the middle of the day, and then peaks in the evening and then goes down again. Nuclear is basically on or off, so it's called base load. It doesn't load follow. Well, if you have wind, which blows primarily at night, and solar, which is during the day, what you get is what's called the duck curve, which means that you have plenty of power at night and plenty of power in the middle of the day, and then a shortage in the morning and a shortage in the peak in the evening. So how do you meet that? Nuclear right now can't meet that because it's just on, so you have to find other ways. Modular nuclear can, because what you can do is you can have several small modular reactors that you can turn on and off to do more of that load following. That's super valuable. So, again, there's a regulatory process because there's new technology, because there's the concerns about the risk of nuclear. But Idaho National Labs, I think, is doing a test on modular nuclear next year. They've been working on it for a while, and I think they're actually starting to do commercial tests next year. And so the hope is that within 10 years, we will have it. Down in the Tri-Cities, where you have lots of experts in nuclear power, they're hoping to put some modular nuclear there, but again, that's about 10 years away. So it's a process. I remember when I met with the Department of Energy in the first Trump administration, I asked them this question: how are we going to do modular nuclear? And the answer was, well, we don't really understand the technology, and so we're having to work with the company to figure out how to regulate them. So we've come a long way since then.
We are getting close to the end of the program, so I'd like our panelists to have one final statement. Todd, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. This was very fun and interesting. I really appreciate both Amanda and Mike coming here. The one theme that I think we all agree on, I think there's probably more disagreement on some things than we've shown here tonight. But one of the things that I really am glad that we agreed on is the power of folks at the local level to do good things. The work that you're doing, I think, has shown, given some good examples. I, for one, love Beavers, and I'm so happy about the work that they're doing. Mike and the Kalispel Tribe and other tribes across the state, I've been so impressed with the ingenuity and the things that they are doing and finding new ways to solve problems and management of both wildlife and forests. And the thing that I am really focused on, having worked in environmental policy for 25 years, is that I think our reflex, or the reflex of a lot of people in environmental policy, is to do what we did in the 1970s because it worked. The Clean Air Act worked. Our air is cleaner because of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Water Act worked. Our water is cleaner because of that. But in the 1970s, those were the best options we had to solve those problems. And so now I think when we are faced with environmental challenges, we go back to those 1970s solutions. We're not there anymore. We have new tools, and the problems and the challenges are different. And as I started this, unfortunately, with too many areas, we are not solving the environmental challenges that face us today. But the good news is that we have new tools and that we can empower people so that whether you are dealing with water conservation or the murder hornet or anything else, local efforts and local empowerment using technology and multiplying those efforts through technology and lots of people doing them can solve the problems that we face today. That, I think, is really exciting, and I think that we are seeing a mindset change about how we tackle environmental problems. And if there's one thing that I would ask people in government, politicians, and the public to take away, it is don't outsource environmental stewardship to other people. Take control yourself, because what you do can make a difference, and you have the power to make a difference in ways that you never have before.
Well, thank you again for the invitation to be here tonight, and you have been such an engaging audience. Thank you for coming with such thoughtful questions and being so attentive. I guess I would like to leave you with this thought, which is that we legislate what we value. We don't make laws about things that we don't care about. We only bother to go into the hard work of making policy and legislation because we care about something and because we value it. And so I think one of the greatest things that's happened in Spokane is the 1974 World's Fair, and not because it was such a successful World's Fair, but because it gave us Riverfront Park, and it gave our citizens the opportunity to have access to the river and the falls and to have their own relationship with that so that they can value it. If we're gonna ask people to conserve water in the summertime and water their lawns less because it's good for the river, they better have access to the river. They better be able to enjoy that river, and thankfully they can. Thankfully here in the city does such a great job of managing really wonderful access points. But we really have to look at, I think the future of a lot of these policies is around enshrining access to our publicly shared lands. Public lands is such a legacy that we can be proud of as Americans. You know, we're owners of that land. Everyone here owns that land. And so enshrining access to those areas so that we can value clean forests and clean water and clean air, I trust that that's what's gonna cause us to work together, and the rest will happen as it needs to happen.
Yeah, this has been great. I was really excited to come here tonight, and it did not disappoint. I think these kind of conversations are necessary to, and this is kind of the beginning. Like, I think that, you know, the disagreements and the nuance, because there's a lot of gray area. and we have to work through that. But if we're not willing to reach across the aisle or talk to the folks that don't agree on everything with us, then we're not going to get to the solutions we need in this complex situation we're in. And I think tribes are really good partners in that. I feel like they can be a pragmatic, solution-based group, partner to have in your group. And I think don't be afraid to reach out and engage with the tribe in your area. They have lots of volunteer opportunities. They're doing a lot of really cool conservation work on the ground. And like Todd said, if you want to get your hands dirty and feel good about it, get out there and do some work. And it's very rewarding. And I, every day I go to work, it's something different, and I love it. And I think conservation is really, really important, because we need those resources. We need that food on the landscape. It's, some of the last, vestiges of something you can go and take and bring home and eat. It costs a lot of money, but it's pretty cool. Not a lot of countries still have that. So it's a true treasure, and I think we need to vote for that. We need to pay for that, and we need to keep it. It's our heritage. So thank you.
A big thank you to all our panelists, and a big thank you to everyone here tonight for coming out and spending your time with us. If you'd like to connect with any of our presenters this evening, you're free to do that. You can do that in just a few moments. We do ask that you wrap things up by 8:45. Thank you so much for being here. Feel free to mingle, enjoy conversations with each other, and some refreshments as well. Thank you.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend, and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.